And now I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much. We thank the Polish presidency for organizing today's meeting. It's a very important issue. This issue of the protection of civilians in armed conflict. We'd also like to thank the UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, and the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Mr. Yves Dacour, and Ms. Edouard, for their contribution to our discussion. We share the Secretary General's inclination towards joining and uniting efforts to prevent conflict and to protect civilians. The central role here is played by the United Nations, international law, and also on traditional, spiritual and moral values. They will enable us to make progress on a united agenda and to overcome any differences of opinion. But today, we can see a very harmful and, to our great regret, this tendency towards the unprecedented politicization of the humanitarian sphere of international relations. Efforts have been made, but nonetheless, thousands of civilians continue to die during the course of conflicts. There is particular concern because the majority of these victims are children, women and older people, medical workers, journalists, and humanitarian personnel. Immediately, people begin to play political strategists with the grief of people. They replace constructive dialogue with a deluge of unverified news and primitive judgments. Accusations appear. The guilty are immediately assigned. Some even stoop to anchoring their accusations with open disinformation received from dubious sources, such as, for example, the notorious White Helmets. From somewhere, a huge quantity of so-called researchers appear, and that's a word in inverted commas, with an obscure mandate from various institutions. In the majority of cases, they carry out their research from a distance, with the basis on reports that have been specifically picked from among the media and information from the internet. These researchers, as a rule, have their own top secret whistleblowers or sources that cannot be revealed under any circumstances. They simply have to be believed. These games, unfortunately, which we are compelled to see regularly, including within the walls of our organization, do not help us to meet the noble aims of preventing and minimizing the suffering of civilians. Double standards, however, alas, can clearly be seen in the news on military campaigns in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, and in other countries. Madam President, we are particularly aggrieved by what is happening in Ukraine. We will talk about this in detail on the 29th of May, on the day when the Polish presidency has planned a special briefing on Ukraine. But given the subject at hand today, I am compelled to share with you the bitter figures of losses among the civilian population. The Polish foreign minister has already mentioned these. As a result of the conflict unleashed by Kiev on its own population since April 2014, in the southeast of Ukraine, more than 2,500 civilians have died. Of these, 105 people died in 2017 and 10 this year so far. Up to 9,000 people have been wounded. Hundreds have gone missing. Among those who have died, there are at least 138 children, 109 of whom with children who died on the territory of Donetsk and Lugansk. At the moment, the intensity of Kiev's bombardment of residential areas has significantly increased, and the open connivance of a range of Western countries in helping Ukraine to violate the Minsk agreements is clearly playing a role here. That agreement is the only legal foundation for the settlement of the situation in the east of that country. Madam President, an important factor in protecting civilians is the activity of humanitarian agencies. The work of these agencies should be built on the UN Charter and basic humanitarian principles, and should supplement efforts to find a political settlement to conflict. In this context, one of the fundamental principles is the principle of respect for state sovereignty and of non-intervention in the domestic affairs of independent states. We continue to have serious concerns at the attempts to use a willful interpretation of norms of international humanitarian law on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, and their identification, the identification of these norms with a whole panoply of different concepts. Recently, one delegation in the Council dreamed up the concept of humanitarian intervention. A missile bombardment of territory of another state was explained as coming from humanitarian considerations. In other words, out of concern for those who were actually being bombarded, obviously. Therefore, I wanted to restate our position that the use of any means to protect civilians, in particular those means that involve the use of force, can only be possible with the support of the UN Security Council and with the unswerving compliance with the provisions of the UN Charter. Madam Ambassador, if I may, I would also like to make one further comment on what the Polish Foreign Minister said. This was on the proposal of an initiative for voluntarily foregoing the veto right in cases of brutality and particularly serious crimes. As you know, the veto is an extremely important component in the UN system of checks and balances. It is the backbone of the mechanism for taking collective decisions. It stimulates the members of the Council to reach compromise. The holding of the right to a veto of the permanent members of the Council is not only a prerogative, it is also a great responsibility and a great commitment. The use of the veto has more than once prevented the UN from being associated with dubious escapades. These, first and foremost, have led to the suffering, indeed, of civilians, and the consequences of such adventures are still palpable in our world. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for his statement.